Over the last few weeks, we've been hearing from the Gospel of Mark, but today we have a scripture reading from the Gospel of John, and it's the famous passage of Jesus and the wine and the wedding at Cana. So I invite you to hear these sacred words from John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. And if you'd like to follow along, you're welcome to, as the words are printed in your bulletins. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out, take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him.
Having endured the hurricane this week and now being in the aftermath, I recalled a hurricane aftermath story that's a favorite of mine from back in 2005. Hurricane Katrina had just ripped through the city of New Orleans. Social workers and churchgoers, college students, and disaster relief helpers were all assisting with food distribution and reconstruction in the immediate moments following the storm. But there was also an older gentleman who had weathered a few previous storms who was in downtown New Orleans. His name was Vernon Worley, and he decided that his best blessing that he might share with the community would be to take on a project that was rather interesting. With the help of cardboard and a laser printer, Worley decided to reattach, perhaps even say reinvent, all of the downtown New Orleans street signs. He visited 166 intersections in downtown New Orleans with a map, and then with some help with masking tape, began to tape on his homemade street signs all over the city. A reporter found Vernon Worley and asked him, "Why are you focusing so much of your attention on street signs when there are clearly so many more immediate needs in this moment?" Worley responded, "I have learned from my faith that what people need more than anything else while enduring a storm is a sign. Just a sign." You ever needed a sign? Ever needed a sign that everything was going to be okay? Ever needed a sign of reassurance following 2 awful storms? Ever needed a sign that the future was going to come back and life was going to return to normal? I mean, we can have doctrine, we can have perhaps dogma, we can have insistent explanation, but we didn't come to church this morning for any one of those, did we? No. What we came to church for this morning was nothing other than a sign. A simple, perhaps even fragile sign that God was with us. Yes, even in all of this mess. That we humans would want a sign was not lost upon Jesus, I would argue. For we walk back into the story of Jesus and the wedding at Cana of Galilee. And part of what we remember about John's gospel is that in John's gospel, there are a series of 7 signs where Jesus communicated to the masses that Jesus was divine, the Son of God. And the first of those 7 signs is right here. We're told in the scripture that there is a cultural faux pas going on, that this ancient Jewish family has run out of wine, and Jesus' mom shares back with Jesus that there is a huge dilemma on the hands of this family, and Jesus' initial reaction is, "Woman, why do you involve me in all of this?" That term woman is very distant, even in the ancient Greek. Jesus talking back perhaps even to mom in that moment. But then, in sensing God's timing, Jesus changes his mind and decides that it is time. And the scholars are quick to point out the one reason why Jesus might have wanted to debut his divinity in this context. Jesus' very first miracle was in response to a human need, in response to a human challenge, simply wanting all to know that Jesus would not remain aloof from the challenges and problems and dilemmas of humanity, but would rather get involved in it all. That is the sign of hope today, that Jesus is still involved, bringing forth help and bringing forth hope. And frankly, I need to remind myself of this, especially this week without the internet. My mind has just been wandering. And I have been wandering and wandering when it comes to my own, hurricane theology. And there's some temptation when it comes to hurricane theology to go down unhelpful paths. To think about, well, there must be some plan or purpose or reason for this storm. And that kind of certainty, it really does bother me. God doesn't use storms to do anything. And then I continue to wander down unhelpful paths. And sometimes I think to myself, well, maybe just all of this is, it could have been worse. But that kind of theology of it could have been worse, or thankfully I'm 100 miles south of it all, or whatnot, it doesn't leave me completely fulfilled, because I consider the lives of those who were more deeply impacted than me, and sharing that, it's not totally fulfilling. And then my mind continues to wander in this kind of unhelpful hurricane theology, and sometimes I make belief that, Jesus must be aloof from it all. That Jesus and all of his holy and sacred power may not want to deal with all of this mess. But a story like ours this morning from the gospel reminds me that Jesus is so much better than that, very much involved. My sense is that Jesus is all about water this morning, standing in some water perhaps in Siesta Key, and wanting to bring forth something just a little bit sweeter. That is the sign of hope that we have today. You're hurting, Jesus is involved in comforting. You are wanting life to return to normal, Jesus is involved in helping. You, like blind Bartimaeus, are running, looking for healing, as the choir sang just a few moments ago. Jesus is involved extending that healing space. That is the sign of hope in this text, that Jesus is not on the sidelines of it all, but rather Jesus is involved. What about you? Have you seen any signs of hope this week? No, not long-term surgeries, but just small signs of Christ being involved. I know I have, for I have watched so many of you in the congregation text, call, email, copying me on emails even, checking on friends, wanting to be of support in the community. I have watched as so many of you have been generous to those who are in need. I have watched so many of you and my own neighbors in my neighborhood be kind toward other neighbors who perhaps they did not even know. I have watched this week as so many have decided to open their doors of their homes to those friends and families who evacuated. And that hospitality, it really was a sign for me that Christ was still involved in all of this. And I have watched as so many have done their part to help make a circumstance that is very messy and very dark just a little bit lighter. I have seen those signs of hope. Have you? I'll conclude this morning with a very interesting bit of trivia about this scripture passage that perhaps you may have never heard before. In John's gospel, there are only 2 times where Jesus' mother appears in that gospel. One is right here in John chapter 2 when Jesus transforms water into wine. And then there's a second time in John's gospel where Jesus' mom reappears. You know where that is? It's in John chapter 19 at the foot of the cross. And you know what the scholars say about that? That maybe, just maybe, what connects Cana and Galilee with what Jesus does on the cross is that once more, Jesus says, you know, Mom, I'm going to get involved in this one too. I am going to bring new life out of, yes, even death, making this sweet. As we press on into our lives in the days and weeks ahead, may we know that the same one who transformed water into wine, who brought new life out of even death, may we know that Jesus is involved. May Jesus be our sign of hope.